That was the one thing I found that was difficult about Games Workshop is that you got really good staff discount, and they would garnish your wage.
Yeah, okay.
So I went from having one Chaos Dwarf army to having like about 5 armies.
Yeah, right. That's how you end up with 13,000 points of Chaos Dwarves. Yeah.
Almost overnight. I had a even though I love my Chaos Dwarves, I think my second favorite army was probably Dark Elves.
Oh,
Because
yes, yes.
Dark Elves had one of the best units ever, as far as I'm concerned, in Fantasy Battle, which was the City Guard.
Yep.
And City Guard was the front row had crossbows and the second row had spears.
Yes.
So if you charged them, you copped a shot from a crossbow if they hadn't fired in the previous turn, and then you hit spears.
Yep. Yep.
So you were 2 wounds as you ran into these people. And even down to, I think, like the Cities of Sigmar army still sort of lean into having, well, they're not called Dark Elves anymore. They're called something else.
Something else.
Eldari, or
Yeah,
I don't know. I
something.
can't remember. But Elveneth, something.
Some fancy name.
Anything to make people not think it's Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, yeah. Some copyrightable name. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've always had an affection in my heart for Dark Elves because that unit was so good. And then there was like the first time I ever did any Zenithal painting was a friend of mine, Matt, who was the one who I was playing with the cigars.
Yep.
He was an amazing painter. He's one of those people that's just naturally a perfect artist. And he did a unit of there were some Dark Elves that rode like a 2-legged lizard.
Oh, yeah. The dark one, the cold ones.
Cold ones, yeah. And he did this beautiful one where he actually spray painted them black and then Zenithal with green.
Oh, yeah.
And then painted the detail, and that was
nice.
stunning. And I was like, I didn't know that there was a name for it until like 3 years ago when the big buzz was Zenithal.
Then it suddenly was everywhere.
And contrast paint.
Yeah.
And it was like, yeah. So, yeah, that was a big problem because I ended up with so many armies.
So much stuff. One of my fantasy, I made like, because I loved, again, fantasy, trying to replicate Warhammer Fantasy was my inroad into the hobby. So I always had this deep affection for Warhammer Fantasy, even though I was playing 40k. And so I made several attempts to get into fantasy, and it, the budget was just like, you're a teenager in high school. You got no fucking money. Like, you got nothing.
Especially if you want to play orcs or goblins and something like that. It was like,
yeah.
Like per unit.
You just needed so much. Skaven or something like that was just well off the cards, right?
I think several. Goblin was like 7 points.
Yeah.
Goblin. So one unit was 70 points. If you're playing a 1,500 point army, that's a fucking lot of goblins.
That's a fucking lot of boxes you got to buy, and they're no cheaper. They're no cheaper than the Space Marines or whatever. I made several attempts to break into Warhammer. So I started several Warhammer Fantasy Battle armies, and Dark Elves was one of them that I remember, trying to, like, come on, let's play. Come on, I can do this. I can play Warhammer Fantasy. And I loved my Dark Elves.
It's one of the reasons why I like Song of Ice and Fire, because it has all of those wheeling rules and stuff like that.
Yep.
And it's not like I find D&D, like I find multi-classing to be really annoying because it's like it's just having your cake and eating it too.
Yep.
Like I remember playing D&D as a kid, and it was like being a monk, you could never use a bladed weapon.
Yes.
And now it's like, oh, I'm a monk barbarian, and it's like, no, you're not. Just stop it. I find that sometimes with some of the armies now, they're a little bit too flexible. There's so much that you can do with them. I found with Fantasy Battle, it was the inflexibilities was what made it fun.
Yeah.
Because you had to tactically overcome. You didn't play to your strengths. You had to overcome your weaknesses, which is how you played that game.
Yes. Yeah.
And I love that. And that's what I like about Song of Ice and Fire. Like the Dothraki in Song of Ice and Fire, there's no foot troops.
Yeah, they're all mounted.
Yep. And that's like such a stunning bit. So like you've got these units on horseback that are massive. And you think that they can plow through things, but they're very susceptible to being attacked because of how big they are. So they can be attacked on multiple sides with the wheeling rules and all the rest of it. So anyway, sad old nerd stuff.
That was one of those wonderful things about old school Warhammer, both 40k and fantasy in particular, was that the army identity, like they each had such a sense of character, both in terms of models and sculpts, but also how they played. And you're right. I think again, I'm talking as a layman because I don't currently play either 40k or fantasy. But it feels like things have gotten a lot more homogenous, sort of thing, like where, and even just from some of the more recent games that I've played, because I've got a bunch of, I think I've got 4 or 5 40k armies sitting in the top of my cupboard that from like 9th edition. And even that was like, they didn't feel different enough from one to the next in terms of, their character and how, like their vibe and how they played. I do miss the days of that where, you'd have lizard men be like, holy fuck me, look at this, and then it'd be just completely different to high elves, which would be completely different to the empire, and that was good. I agree, that was pretty cool.
It's just like I very much find that back in those days, it was like I like playing poker, and it was very much like in poker, you don't play the cards, you play your opponent.
Yeah.
With fantasy back in the day, like I said, you don't play your opponent, you play to what your weaknesses are against that army, and you find a way to overcome that. And tactically, that was where my whole hobgoblin idea came from.
Yeah.
Was like, you don't get many models in a Chaos Dwarf army because they've got cannons and stuff like that. So you can take a little bit of extra by chucking 40 orcs in there, which just become this force that distracts everybody because there's this big block of orcs.
So your solution was to multi-class.
It was an ally rule, and I could do it.
Oh dear.